Representative Jasmine Crockett made it unmistakably clear that the moment unfolding inside the hearing room was not business as usual. This was not, in her view, a routine exercise in congressional oversight where prepared statements are read, predictable questions are asked, and carefully worded responses are delivered for the record. Instead, she framed the exchange as a defining test of accountability at the highest levels of American government. From the outset, Crockett signaled that the gravity of the subject matter demanded more than procedural formalities. It required candor, transparency, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths head-on. The focus of her concern centered on materials connected to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, whose criminal network and associations have continued to generate public scrutiny years after his death. Crockett argued that thousands of documents tied to Epstein's activities contained references to influential and well-connected individuals. In her telling, the sheer volume of material warranted deeper examination and a more transparent accounting from federal authorities. She emphasized that oversight is not merely about reviewing paperwork, it is about ensuring that justice institutions operate without fear or favor, regardless of whose names may appear in investigative files. Throughout her remarks, Crockett underscored what she described as a troubling gap between public expectations and institutional response. She suggested that when documents reference powerful figures, whether directly or indirectly, the obligation to clarify facts becomes even more pressing. For her, the issue was not about speculation or sensationalism, but about process and principle. If questions exist within official records, she argued, they must be addressed openly. Silence or deflection in such circumstances risks eroding public trust. Rather than beginning with a conventional line of questioning directed immediately at Pam Bondi, Crockett took an approach that shifted the emotional and moral tone of the hearing. She openly signaled skepticism about whether straightforward answers would be forthcoming. That skepticism itself became part of her message. By voicing doubt about transparency before even posing detailed questions, she reframed the exchange as a broader commentary on institutional credibility. It was a rhetorical move designed to elevate the stakes of the conversation beyond partisan disagreement and into the realm of ethical responsibility. Crockett's method suggested that oversight, in her view, cannot be effective if those conducting it assume good faith without verification. She implied that accountability requires more than polite inquiry. It requires persistence and, when necessary, confrontation. Her tone indicated that the hearing was not simply about clarifying technical details, but about examining whether the Department of Justice was prepared to pursue truth wherever it might lead. That framing placed Bondi in a position where silence or narrow responses could be interpreted as insufficient. In referencing the Epstein materials, Crockett was careful to distinguish between documented mentions and allegations of criminal wrongdoing. She did not present conclusions. Instead, she emphasized the need for transparent investigation. This distinction was significant. By clarifying that raising questions is not the same as making accusations, she attempted to anchor her remarks in procedural fairness. Yet she also stressed that proximity, repeated references, or patterns within documents can legitimately prompt scrutiny. In her view, the public deserves clarity when the names of prominent individuals appear within the context of serious criminal investigations. The broader implication of Crockett's remarks extended beyond any single person. She framed the issue as emblematic of a justice system at a crossroads. Institutions, she argued, must demonstrate that they are willing to examine evidence impartially, even when doing so may be politically sensitive. The credibility of federal law enforcement, in her estimation, depends on consistent standards. If ordinary citizens are investigated thoroughly when evidence surfaces, then powerful figures must be subject to the same rigor. Anything less risks creating a perception of double standards. Her skepticism about transparency also reflected a larger concern about public confidence. In recent years, debates surrounding high-profile investigations have intensified partisan divides. Crockett's comments suggested that restoring trust requires proactive openness rather than defensive posture. By questioning whether honest answers would be provided, she highlighted what she sees as a deficit in confidence between the public and those entrusted with enforcing the law. That deficit, she implied, can only be repaired through forthright engagement. Crockett's rhetorical strategy transformed the hearing from a procedural event into a symbolic moment. She positioned herself not merely as a lawmaker asking questions, but as a representative voicing broader societal concerns. Her language conveyed urgency. Accountability, she suggested, is not optional, it is foundational to democratic governance. When allegations involve networks of influence and potential misconduct, oversight cannot be perfunctory. In emphasizing the scale of the Epstein documents, Crockett invoked the idea that volume itself can be meaningful. Thousands of references, she argued, cannot simply be brushed aside as incidental. Even if each mention requires context, the accumulation demands systematic review. This argument rests on the principle that patterns matter in investigative work. Transparency about how those patterns are assessed, she contended, is essential for maintaining legitimacy. Her remarks also underscored the role of Congress as a co-equal branch of government. Oversight hearings are designed to ensure that executive agencies operate within the bounds of law and ethical responsibility. By pressing the Department of Justice for clarity, Crockett framed herself as fulfilling that constitutional duty. She implied that deference without scrutiny would amount to abdication of responsibility. At the same time, Crockett's approach reflected an awareness of the sensitivity of the subject. The Epstein case has long been surrounded by speculation, misinformation, and intense public emotion. By grounding her comments in documented references rather than rumor, she sought to maintain a measured tone while still conveying seriousness. Her insistence on transparency did not equate to presumption of guilt, rather it emphasized the importance of process. The shift in tone that she created had practical consequences within the hearing room. Observers noted the heightened attention as she spoke, a recognition that the discussion had moved into more consequential territory. In political settings, tone can shape perception as much as substance. Crockett's framing elevated the exchange from technical oversight to a moral and institutional examination. Ultimately, her remarks can be understood as part of a broader conversation about power and accountability in American governance. When investigations intersect with prominent individuals, questions about impartiality inevitably arise. Crockett argued that confronting those questions directly is healthier for the system than allowing doubt to fester. Transparency, even when uncomfortable, strengthens institutions in the long run. By challenging the adequacy of routine oversight and demanding direct engagement with difficult issues, Crockett sought to redefine the purpose of the hearing. She portrayed accountability not as a partisan weapon, but as a shared obligation. Whether one agrees with her framing or not, her approach underscored the enduring tension between political influence and the ideal of equal justice under law. In that sense, the moment was about more than any single document or reference. It was about the standards by which institutions measure themselves. Crockett's insistence on clarity reflected a conviction that credibility must be earned continuously. When serious allegations intersect with powerful networks, the response cannot be ambiguity. It must be transparency, thoroughness, and adherence to principle. Through her words and strategy, Crockett transformed what might have been a predictable oversight exchange into a pointed inquiry about integrity at the highest levels of leadership. By openly questioning whether honest answers would be provided, she compelled attention not only to the content of the Epstein files, but also to the broader question of how justice is administered in a democracy. In doing so, she positioned accountability as the central theme of the hearing, an obligation that transcends party lines and speaks directly to the core responsibilities of leadership. As her questioning continued, Jasmine Crockett made clear that, in her view, the matter extended far beyond any single individual whose name might appear in investigative records. The deeper issue, she argued, was whether the justice system applies the law evenly when powerful figures are involved. For Crockett, the central concern was not personality, but principle. Are those with influence and status treated differently than ordinary citizens when allegations surface? That question, she suggested, lay at the heart of the hearing. She accused leadership within the Department of Justice of directing enforcement energy toward targets that were politically convenient while failing to pursue meaningful accountability connected to Jeffrey Epstein's broader network. In her telling, the imbalance was striking. While certain cases moved swiftly and aggressively, investigations tied to Epstein's associates appeared, from her perspective, to stall or fade from public view. She did not frame this as a bureaucratic oversight, but as a potential pattern, one that, if true, would raise profound concerns about equal protection under the law. Then, Crockett widened the lens even further. According to her remarks, the situation was no longer just about Epstein-related documents or past associations. Instead, she characterized it as part of a broader trend in which prosecutions, investigative decisions, and enforcement priorities appeared to be influenced by political calculations rather than neutral legal standards. That assertion marked a turning point in her testimony. It transformed the hearing from a focused inquiry into specific files into a sweeping critique of institutional direction. What followed was not a single accusation, but a structured argument. Crockett began listing actions she believed demonstrated that the Department of Justice had drifted away from what she described as its core mission. The tone inside the chamber shifted palpably. Lawmakers who had been listening quietly began leaning forward. Staffers exchanged glances. The controversy was no longer confined to one set of documents. It had expanded into a confrontation over the department's identity and integrity. At that point, Crockett pivoted deliberately. Rather than revisiting alleged Epstein connections, she turned her focus squarely toward Pam Bondi and the period since Bondi assumed office. Crockett reminded the committee that Bondi had entered her role promising two central priorities: ending what the administration described as the weaponization of justice, and restoring the Department of Justice to what supporters had called its foundational mission: fairness, impartiality, and equal enforcement under the law. Crockett then delivered one of the sharpest lines of her testimony. She argued that not only had those promises gone unfulfilled, but that the department's recent actions suggested movement in the opposite direction. Rather than reducing perceptions of politicization, she contended, certain decisions had amplified them. The contrast between rhetoric and outcome, she implied, was too stark to ignore. From there, she began enumerating examples, one by one, building her case incrementally. She referenced arrests and investigations involving members of the press, arguing that journalists had faced aggressive federal scrutiny in instances where courts later questioned the legal foundations of those actions. While she did not deny the government's authority to investigate potential wrongdoing, she suggested that repeated judicial pushback signaled possible overreach. If cases collapse under legal scrutiny, she argued, lawmakers must examine why they were initiated in the first place. Crockett also pointed to raids and prosecutions that judges or grand juries ultimately declined to support. In her framing, those outcomes were not isolated setbacks, but indicators of a pattern. To her, they suggested that some enforcement actions may have been pursued without sufficient evidentiary grounding. She emphasized that the power to arrest, indict, and prosecute is among the most formidable tools the federal government possesses. Exercising that power without solid legal footing, she warned, risks undermining public trust. The implication was unmistakable. If prosecutions repeatedly falter in court, the issue may not lie solely with judicial interpretation, but with prosecutorial judgment. Crockett stopped short of alleging deliberate misconduct in every instance, but she questioned whether institutional incentives were skewed. Were cases being filed for deterrence, for optics, for political messaging? Those were the questions she left hanging in the chamber. She then expanded her critique to include student protesters and political critics whom she said had faced threats of prosecution or heightened scrutiny. In contrast, she argued, investigations linked to Epstein's wider network appeared comparatively stagnant. That juxtaposition, in her telling, reflected misplaced priorities. While young demonstrators and dissenting voices encountered swift enforcement responses, cases involving powerful networks seemed mired in delay. The testimony did not end there. Crockett introduced disputes involving technology companies and federal pressure related to certain online platforms connected to national security monitoring tools. She contended that actions taken in those contexts may have inadvertently weakened public safety mechanisms rather than strengthened them. By inserting national security into her critique, she broadened the stakes even further. Now the debate was not only about civil liberties or prosecutorial discretion, it was about whether enforcement decisions might carry unintended consequences for the country's broader safety architecture. As she spoke, her pace quickened, each example layered upon the previous one, forming a cumulative argument that the Department of Justice was drifting from independent adjudication toward politicized calculation. Observers in the room noted that the atmosphere had shifted from tense to openly confrontational. The testimony was no longer a list of concerns, it was an indictment of direction. Then, Crockett raised one of the most serious allegations of the hearing. She claimed that the department had interfered or halted investigations involving federal officials accused of misconduct, including matters connected to alleged bribery inquiries. Such claims, if substantiated, would represent a direct challenge to the department's duty to investigate corruption impartially. She argued that shutting down or sidelining those inquiries damaged public confidence and fueled perceptions that some officials operate beyond accountability. From there, she pivoted to election integrity concerns. Crockett alleged that federal authorities had obtained or sought voter data from local jurisdictions in ways she believed raised questions about federal overreach ahead of upcoming elections. Supporters of the administration vigorously disputed that characterization, insisting that any such actions were lawful and necessary. Yet inside the hearing room, the mere introduction of election-related concerns intensified the clash. Election administration is among the most politically sensitive domains in American governance. By raising it, Crockett underscored her argument that enforcement choices reverberate far beyond courtroom walls. She then introduced another issue she described as a constitutional violation, a proposed financial benefit connected to the sitting president, reportedly valued at approximately $230 million. Crockett argued that the Constitution restricts outside compensation to a president beyond an official salary during their term in office. Allowing such financial gain, she contended, would conflict with those constitutional limitations. She framed the issue not as partisan rivalry, but as a structural safeguard designed to prevent conflicts of interest and foreign influence. Her conclusion was direct and unsparing. History, she said, would judge the leadership of the Department of Justice based on whether it protected constitutional principles or political power. It was among the harshest criticisms delivered during the hearing, and it hung in the air long after she spoke the words. When Crockett yielded her time, anticipation filled the chamber. Lawmakers, reporters, and observers expected Pam Bondi to address the extensive list of allegations point by point. The accusations had been detailed and wide-ranging, touching on press freedom, prosecutorial standards, national security, corruption investigations, election oversight, and constitutional finance restrictions. Instead, Bondi pivoted. Rather than responding directly to each example Crockett had cited, she shifted her remarks toward criticisms of Democratic leadership and broader political controversies. To Crockett's allies, that response appeared evasive, a deflection rather than engagement. They argued that failing to rebut specific claims reinforced concerns about transparency. Bondi supporters, by contrast, maintained that many of Crockett's assertions were inaccurate or politically motivated and did not warrant granular rebuttal in that setting. Regardless of perspective, the exchange marked a decisive moment in the hearing. What began as oversight concerning investigative files had evolved into a sweeping confrontation over the direction, independence, and credibility of the Department of Justice. Crockett's testimony reframed the debate around a singular question: is justice being administered impartially, or are enforcement choices shaped by political context? By the end of the session, the chamber no longer felt like a routine oversight venue. It had become a stage for competing narratives about institutional integrity. Crockett had constructed a case built on accumulation, example after example, designed to illustrate a broader thesis. To supporters of Pam Bondi, her response during the closing stretch of the hearing amounted to pushing back against what they viewed as partisan attacks. From their perspective, the accusations leveled by Jasmine Crockett were framed in a way designed to create political pressure rather than illuminate verified misconduct. They argued that in highly charged congressional settings, broad claims are often presented without the full evidentiary context that formal investigations require. In that light, Bondi's decision to widen the discussion and point to alleged hypocrisy among critics was, in their eyes, a defense against selective outrage. But regardless of how her response was interpreted, one fact remained. Many of Crockett's central accusations were left hanging in the air as the exchange moved into its final phase. And that final phase was no longer just about individual claims, investigative decisions, or disputed interpretations of documents tied to Jeffrey Epstein. It evolved into something broader, a debate over the health and credibility of the American justice system itself. By the time Crockett concluded her structured list of allegations, the tone inside the hearing room had fundamentally shifted. What began as a tense but familiar oversight hearing had transformed into a larger argument about institutional integrity. Lawmakers were no longer simply debating case management decisions. They were grappling with a more existential question: is accountability within the Department of Justice functioning as intended, especially when investigations intersect with power and influence? Crockett's argument was cumulative. She did not limit herself to one investigation or one controversy. Instead, she described what she believed was a pattern, an enforcement environment where critics, journalists, protesters, or political opponents appeared to encounter aggressive federal action, while powerful individuals linked to sensitive investigations seemed comparatively insulated from scrutiny. Whether one agreed with her framing or not, the scope of her critique was unmistakable. That, she argued, was why the Epstein files mattered so profoundly. In her view, they symbolized more than archived evidence from a single criminal prosecution. They represented a test of whether influence and status could shape investigative momentum. If names surfaced repeatedly within official records, she maintained the public deserved to know whether those references were pursued with the same diligence applied in less politically sensitive cases. Throughout her remarks, Crockett repeatedly returned to the survivors connected to Epstein's trafficking operation. Many of them, she had pointed out earlier, were seated only feet away from the witness table during the hearing. For those individuals, transparency was not an abstract political demand. It was personal. It was about whether every lead was followed and whether every potential enabler, regardless of status, faced scrutiny under the law. She argued that if evidence existed connecting additional individuals to wrongdoing, then the public deserved clarity on how those leads were handled. And if certain investigations were closed, narrowed, or deprioritized, Congress deserved an explanation grounded in law and evidence. That, she emphasized, was the essence of oversight, not partisan spectacle, but constitutional responsibility. What stood out to many observers, however, was Bondi's strategic choice in response. Rather than addressing each allegation point by point, particularly those tied to enforcement priorities or document references, she broadened the frame. She referenced political double standards, criticized Democratic leadership, and suggested that some of the accusations were driven more by politics than by proof. Supporters saw that approach as necessary pushback. They argued that the hearing itself reflected the charged climate surrounding high-profile cases, and that not every allegation warranted detailed rebuttal in a public forum. Critics viewed the moment differently. In their assessment, the absence of direct answers to specific questions, especially those concerning investigative consistency, reinforced rather than alleviated suspicion. In congressional hearings, what is not said can carry as much weight as what is spoken. The official record preserves both direct responses and moments of redirection. Crockett's allies later argued that Bondi had missed an opportunity to clearly reject or rebut the claims using concrete evidence. Bondi's defenders countered that the accusations were interpretations of incomplete information and that detailed investigative matters are not always suited for public debate. The divide reflected a much larger national conversation already unfolding beyond the hearing chamber, one centered on trust. Trust in institutions, trust in investigations involving powerful individuals, trust in whether the Department of Justice operates independently from political influence. Those questions cannot be resolved in a single afternoon of testimony, but hearings like this amplify them. As the exchange wrapped up, it became evident that neither side had persuaded the other. Crockett remained firm in her assertion that serious questions were unanswered. Bondi maintained that the department was acting within the bounds of law and procedure. Yet the confrontation ensured that the allegations, the document references, and the competing interpretations were now permanently embedded in the congressional record. And that permanence matters. Oversight hearings do not typically conclude debates. They often ignite them. Once claims are entered into the record, they can prompt follow-up requests, additional document demands, and further committee inquiries. Public interest can intensify. Advocacy groups may call for renewed investigations. Media narratives continue to evolve long after cameras stop recording. In her closing moments, Crockett stepped back from the granular accusations and reframed the issue once more. She argued that the larger question was not about one attorney general or one administration alone. It was about whether accountability applies equally to everyone in the United States. The Epstein files, she said, symbolized the intersection of wealth, influence, and alleged criminal activity that harmed vulnerable individuals. When investigations involving such intersections appear incomplete, public confidence begins to erode. Her warning was straightforward. Transparency is most essential when cases involve powerful figures. Without transparency, speculation fills the void. And once institutional trust weakens, restoring it becomes exponentially more difficult. For Crockett, the hearing was not merely about highlighting perceived shortcomings. It was about urging vigilance, both within Congress and among the public. Bondi, for her part, maintained that the Department of Justice was operating according to evidence, legal standards, and established procedures. She suggested that heated political environments often produce sweeping accusations that outpace what investigations ultimately substantiate. In her framing, the department's responsibility is to follow the law, not political pressure. The enduring image of the hearing, therefore, became one of stark contrast. One side insisted that unresolved questions demanded sharper scrutiny and clearer answers. The other insisted that politically charged claims were being used to undermine institutional credibility. That tension is not new in American politics, but moments like this crystallize it. Regardless of political alignment, one outcome was undeniable. The Epstein files, DOJ enforcement priorities, and the broader questions raised during the hearing were now firmly woven into the national conversation. The debate would not end with adjournment. It would continue in committee rooms, media discussions, and public forums. Oversight, by design, is iterative. It evolves. It invites further inquiry. Whether new investigations or disclosures follow remains uncertain, but the exchange demonstrated how a single hearing can reshape public discourse around power, transparency, and justice.